What are your favorite 2 or 3 story worlds, and what makes them so special?
Wow, that's a tough one. That's like asking people like their favorite movies. I think I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I have been since I was a kid, and I think that the thing that made Star Wars outpace its contemporaries is the story world. And it's interesting, I always sort of put up these two, I juxtaposed 2 movies, and by saying in 1977 2 movies were released, the same genre, the same budget, the same target market, the same everything, which was Close Encounters of a Third Kind and Star Wars. One did really well and had a good box office return. Another became a $60 billion brand. And what's the difference? I think, for me, clearly, Steven Spielberg is the superior filmmaker from a craft standpoint. But what was it about Star Wars that made it outpace, Close Encounters? Not just Close Encounters, but everything else. And now, obviously to Disney, it's still growing. And I was reading a book that actually had an interview with Steven Spielberg where they asked him that same question. They said, why did Star Wars do so much better? And he said there was 2 reasons. He said, George always had a bigger vision than just a single movie, and I always just saw Close Encounters as one thing. And then he said, 2, because he had that big vision, he created a world that people wanted to explore. And he said, I didn't even consider my story world by doing Close Encounters. I was just focused on the plot. So George Lucas really created a story world that people wanted to explore, and that's something that I gravitated to as a kid. And so I'm a fan. I'm a fan of Star Wars. I'm a fan. There's things like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, fantasy worlds I'm a big fan of. But recently I've been really interested in story worlds that aren't sort of sci-fi epics or fantasy epics, sword and sandal type stuff. One tremendous story world that I don't think gets enough credit is Deadwood. I think Deadwood has a tremendous story world where if you watch Deadwood, anybody's watched Deadwood, is that the physical geographic size of Deadwood is not that big, but it had such a robust, interesting collection of characters that I thought that story world was tremendous in its story potential, and I'm happy they're going to bring a feature film back to sort of cap the whole thing off. But I always just loved that story world specifically. Another HBO show that I'm a big fan of the story world is Sharp Objects, and that was a recent show with was Amy Adams, and I thought the story world of Wind Gap, of where that story was set, was such an interesting, cool, weird, creepy Midwest town that I just thought that was like tremendous. So story worlds don't necessarily have to be the sword and sandal, Game of Thrones, Star Wars thing. They don't have to be set in space. They don't have to, have superheroes in them. Story worlds are interesting places that have great story potential. That's all a story world is if you understand your story world, you will always understand your story potential, and great story worlds will continue or have the potential of continually creating stories over time. And I can see by looking at Wind Gap, by looking at Deadwood, by looking at Star Wars, I can see multiple stories. Whether they may not all be TV, they may not all be feature films, but there's something. Right? And fans, like being a Sharp Objects fan or being a Deadwood fan, I don't care what platform they're delivered in. I don't care if it's as a film or a television show. If there's a Deadwood book, I'll read it. If there's a Deadwood game, I'll play it. If there's a Deadwood book of poetry, I'll read it, because I like to play in that world. That's the sandbox. And so just as a fan, those are a big fan of Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I think that's an underrated story world as well. But those, I didn't give you 2 or 3. I give you like 7. But those are the things that I lean to.
It'd be interesting to see if Philip K. Dick were still alive, what story worlds would have come from his stories.
Sure.
Because you could go so many different places with it.
100%. And it's really interesting is for independent filmmakers, a lot of filmmaking and financing and selling a script is you have to generate pre-awareness. You have to have some sort of brand awareness to be able to sell to the studios or get something optioned. And that's is it based on the book? Is it based on something like that? That's what a lot of independent filmmakers and writers get into. Is I write a script and it's great, but it has no brand awareness or no pre-awareness engineered. So no one will pick it up. No one will option it. There's a lot of stuff in the public domain, especially in the sci-fi genre, that have tremendous story worlds, including some Philip K. Dick stuff. Isaac Asimov had great story worlds. Most of his stuff is in the public domain. Jules Verne had tremendous story worlds, and all of his stuff is in the public domain. The Wizard of Oz, one of the greatest story worlds of all time, Oz, is in the public domain, which means anybody, any of us, can do a Wizard of Oz project set in the story world of the Wizard of Oz. And so that's an interesting asset to be able to identify Philip K. Dick stuff, Isaac Asimov stuff, Jules Verne stuff, Wizard of Oz stuff, and say, here's the sandbox. I don't necessarily want to retell the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy's story's already told. But the story world gives me a sandbox in which to operate, in which to play. I'll tell a completely different story in there that is just set in that world, but then allows me to use the pre-awareness of Oz to be able to leverage myself into a less risky proposition to the studios, the networks, or the agents that I want to be able to send my stuff to. I think it's an underutilized asset of understanding what's in the public domain. Tremendous story worlds that are there.